Hi everyone. Adam passes on his apologies. He couldn't get here. He's very sad about it. To be honest with you, this is not my area of expertise, so please don't shoot the messenger. But but I will do my best to do Adam.
I just want to mention there are no talks after this, so please feel free to ask.
It's all right. I've got an answer to that question, which is ask Adam. So any question. So basically, Adam's been working on typologies and is trying to work out how, or has been starting to think about how analytical methods might affect the way that typologies are developed. So, as you all know, there's lots and lots of stuff out there that kind of shows the importance of understanding heterogeneity in terms of participation and responses to fisheries management. And there are numerous pieces of work that have demonstrated the importance of understanding angular heterogeneity. There are several accepted theories around this, including motivation, specialization, enduring involvement, that are well kind of set up in the literature. So where we started with this was trying to understand some of the kind of categories that we have of marine recreational anglers in the UK. So Adam started to run large questionnaires with lots and lots of questions and did some great analysis on it, and it resulted in 4 clusters. And these clusters were consumer, trophy, leisure and social anglers. And those things are those similar clusters to those are quite common across the world, just have slightly different names in different areas. But the kind of critical observations that he had were that you know, the data collection that we used to kind of do this. I know what Sean said earlier, but this one was about the same length as that. It was a huge undertaking. He included all kind of questions that he could, and that's great. And it was really good for this piece of work. But if we wanted to actually think about how typologies might change, how whether there are different drivers for things, then it's very, very complex to redo that. So we were kind of wondering whether there are ways that we could simplify what was going on and that would allow us to ask these questions more regularly and to understand how things were changing. And there are kind of a number of different things out there in terms of other nature-based studies, and criticisms have kind of emerged within those around the fundamental value and the strengths of typologies. In particular, there was a study of Swedish forest owners demonstrating that essentially that you could assign the same individuals in studies to different clusters depending on how you analyse the data, which is not too big a surprise. So, the aim of the overall study was really to assess the impact of applying alternate analytical methods to simplify the metrics needed to classify respondents into clusters using typology of recreational sea anglers that we developed in previous studies. So the idea was specifically to test how well the outcomes of the new analysis predicted angler behaviour and therefore allow some judgment on the nature of the typologies and assess what implications were for fisheries managers. So we developed some specific questions that guided us towards meeting these aims, but it's dependent, you really need to know a little bit about what was done in the past. So in the typology that we delivered, or that we developed, we got responses from anglers in England and Wales. There were 453 of them, and we had 43 variables in there. The typology was developed through PCA and cluster analysis and gave us these 4 groups that I described earlier. And we ended up with quite a strong typology model that allowed us to predict both stewardship norms and behaviour. So the next thing to do was kind of think about, well, what are the research questions? Well, how do we simplify the typology? Can we eliminate the PCA that we had to use and use simpler approaches? Do we need to actually do all of these 43 variables where there's kind of room for kind of human error in how you might categorize those things? So could we actually simplify this and repeat it with a smaller number of variables? And if reproduction is not possible, how did that typology compare? And if that didn't compare well, what would that mean in terms of typologies? So here's so basically to recreate the typology, we selected 10 statements, or that we had 10 kind of areas that were covered in the previous typology, and we picked the top kind of ranking question in each of those areas. And basically from because we then were moving towards a Likert scale, we couldn't use k-means analysis as in the previous cluster analysis, because we moved to a kind of step scale rather than a numeric scale. We then applied a two-factor cluster analysis, which was performed based on cluster membership based on a modeling algorithm. This kind of used log likelihood comparison to a multinomial normal distribution, which was generated from our sample data. The method generated a number of different clusters based on the selected input variables, and the quality of the model was judged in the way that most people do, using the silhouette coefficients. And the quality levels are shown on the slide here. The analysis was iterative as well, involving the removal of variables with lower scores in order to maximize the silhouette coefficient, which in turn affected the number of clusters. So what did we find then? So the initial two-step clustering involved 10 component-based variables and resulted in a two-cluster model, but the silhouette coefficient from that model was really tiny at 0.1. And variables were then tested based on, or various scenarios were tested based on variable removals. The most suitable solution that we found was actually involved 3 variables: awareness of environmental consequences, environmental responsibility, and biocentrism. And 2 clusters of equal size. The silhouette coefficient for this was okay. It was 0.3, which is classed as fair. And visual kind of inspection of the Likert responses showed that the clusters were really kind of distinguished by their pro-environmental attitudes. Cluster 2, however, was much less positive, with far fewer strongly agreeing to corresponding statements around the kind of pro-environmental attitudes. And we were able to do some Mann-Whitney U tests on these things as well that allowed us to demonstrate that there were significant differences across all of the 3 input variables. So then when we started to look at Mann-Whitney U tests, so these are the differences between the clusters, and we tested against both the stewardship norms and the private stewardship behaviours, so the personal stewardship norms and the private stewardship behaviours. And in that we found that the results were significant for the stewardship norms, but not for the private stewardship behaviours. So how does our typology, this reduced typology, compare to the previous typology? Well, you can see the previous typology across the x-axis there, and then you can see how many people from each of the clusters were in each of those groups in our new typology. So what we could find from that was that the current typology did relate to our previous work, but in cluster 2 there was a larger representation of social anglers and consumer anglers than there was in cluster 1, and cluster 2 had a smaller representation of trophy anglers. So what does this actually mean in reality? I'm going through this at a speed. So we had to use a fundamentally different analysis technique to deal with the data in the study, so there's a bit of a difference there. The original typology could not be replicated by adopting a simplified approach, as it's replaced a binary model clustering focus, or it was replaced by the binary model focused on pro-environmentalism. Our suggestion here is that two clusters are perhaps named as mid and high-level pro-environmental neighbour. There are also observational patterns suggesting that trophy anglers are represented more in the mid-level environmental cluster at the expense of the low numbers of consumers. The strength of the cluster model could only be improved to an acceptable level by removing 7 of the domains, leaving only 3 variables. So it's very few left. And the reduction components produced angling clusters that were defined on fewer dimensions of the angling experience. So there's a loss of data really in this new typology, and that's reflected in the weaker performance in explaining the differences between the two clusters in stewardship behaviour. It's that makes it easier to understand why typologies have started to be criticised in other areas, as highlighted at the start of the presentation. We've seen from the same data, from the same people, construed in 2 different ways, that you can get different outputs depending on the analytical technique. But what does this actually mean in terms of the nature of typologies? And both of these methods are actually statistically supported. Perhaps really that this implies that in an exploratory context to inform general unspecified management of fisheries in open access mixed species environments, our previous typology is probably the way forwards. But for specific management focused on, for example, environmental protection campaigns, fisheries managers may wish to apply the current typology to inform the work or engagement with angler stakeholders. That would be far simpler to apply, and maybe this suggests that rather than searching for a single most effective typology, maybe we should be searching for the most effective suite of typologies to apply and cope with different contexts and policy aims. So that was all Adam wanted me to say. Thank you very much. Don't ask me any questions, please.